Hello, today we're going to learn more about 1920s Western fashion. The 1920s saw modernization in fashion. It continued the change from more restrictive fashions in the Victorian or Edwardian period towards looser clothing, which revealed more of the arms and leg, which had begun at least a decade prior, with the rising hemlines to the ankle and the movement of S-band corset, movement away from the S-band corsets to the calmer columnar silhouette in the 1910s. Men also began to wear less formal daily attire, and athletic clothing such as sportswear began part of the mainstream fashion for the first time. 1920s are characterized by two distinct periods of fashion. In the early part of the decade, change was slower and there was more reluctance to the new, revealing styles that made popular. From 1925, the public more passionately embraced the style now typically associated with the Roaring Twenties. These styles continued to characterize fashion until the worldwide depression worsened in 1930s. So now let's look at the overview or summary of the 1920s fashion. After World War I, the United States entered into a prosperous era, and as a result of its role in the war, came out on top of the world onto the world stage. Social customs and morals were relaxed in an optimism brought by the end of the war and the booming of the stock market. Women were entering to the workplace in record numbers. A nationwide prohibition on alcohol was ignored by many. There was revolution in almost every sphere of human activity. Fashion was no exception. As women entered the workplace and earned the right to vote, fashion trend became more accessible, masculine, and more practical. Flappers were a popular name given to a woman of this time because of what they wore, and the constrictive corset and essential undergarment to make the waist thinner became a thing of the past. Now, let's look at technological development of new fabrics and new means fastening clothing effects. Fashions of 1920s. Natural fabrics such as cotton and wool were the abundant fabric of the decade. Silk was highly desired for its luxurious qualities, but the limited supply made it expensive. So in the late 19th century, artificial silk has first made from the solution of cellulose in France. After being patented in the US, the first American plant began production of its new fabric in 1910s. This fiber became known as the Rayon. Rayon stocking became more popular in the decade as a substitute for silk stocking. Rayon was also used in some undergarments. Many garments before 1920s were fastened with buttons and lacing. However, during the decade, development of the metal hooks and eyes meant that there was easier means of fastening clothing. Shirts, hook and eye, buttons, zippers, and snaps were all utilized to fasten clothing. Absolutely amazing information, and I had never thought of that before. Zippers were not very famous before the 20s. Vastly improved production methods enabled manufacturers to easily produce clothing affordable by working families. The average person's fashion sense became more sophisticated. Meanwhile, working-class women looked for a modern form of dresses as they transitioned from rural to urban career, taking their cue from the wealthier women. Working women began wearing less expensive variations of the day suit, adopting a more modern look that seemed to suit their new technologically focused careers. Typists and telephone operators. Although the simple lines and minimal abdominal region on the runways, 1920s were not free of luxury. Expensive fabrics, including silk and velvet and satin, were favored by high-end designers, while department stores carried less expensive variation on those designs made of newly available synthetic fabrics. The use of mannequins became widespread during the 20s and served as a way to show shoppers how to combine and accessorize new fashion. The modern fashion cycle, established 1920s, still dominates the industry today. Designers favored separates in new fabrics like jersey that could be combined and matched work with modern, informal, unchaperoned social activities like attending films, theater, and car rides. Absolutely interesting, wonderful. Downton Abbey in the 20s was such a big change. Women's rights and the clothing, the work, the mentality, everything changed during this time, and such a big change. It's worth its own little category of revolution. Now let's look into the women's wear. Paris set fashion trends for Europe and North Korea. The fashion for women was all about letting loose. Women wore dresses all day, every day. Day dresses had drop to waist, which had a slash or belt around the low waist and or hip, and a skirt that hung anywhere from ankle up to the knee, never above the knee. They were or had sleeves long to mid bicep, and the skirt that was straight pleated hem or tied. Hair was often bobbed, giving a boyish look. For men in white-collar jobs, business suits were the day-to-day attire. Striped plaid window pane suits came in a dark blue, grey, and brown in the winter, ivory white, tan pastels in the summertime. Shirts were white and neckties were essential. Clothing fashions changed with women's changing role in society, particularly in the idea of new fashion. Although society matrons of a certain age continued to wear conservative dresses or sportswear were worn by forward-looking and younger women, became the great change in the post-war fashion. The tubular dress of the teens had evolved into a similar silhouette that now sported shorter skirts with pleats, garters, and slits to allow motion. The most memorable fashion trend of the roaring 20s was undoubtedly the flapper look. A flapper dress was a functional and flattering the bust line rather than accentuating it. Straight line chemise, topped by the close-fitting cloche hat, became uniform of the day. Women bobbed or cut their hair short to fit the under popular hats. The radical move in the beginning, but standard by the end of the decade. Low-waisted dresses with fullness of the hemline allowed the woman to literally kick up their heels and dance like the Charleston. In 1925, shift dresses with no waistline emerged. At the end of the decade, dresses were being worn with straight bodices and collars. Tucks at the bottom of the bodice were popular, as well as knife pleat skirt with hem approximately 1 inch below the knee. In the world of art, fashion was being influenced heavily by art movements such as Surrealism. After World War I, popular art saw a slow transition from the lush, curvilinear abstraction of Art Nouveau decoration to the more mechanized and smooth geometric forms of the Art Deco. You know, those 1920s Art Deco where just geometric shapes and curvatures, beautiful designs. It's still very popular of that era. It's popularized. It comes back in style a lot. It's just synonymous to of such a romantic type of roaring 20s, yet regal, royal, rich textures type of notion these days. Now Elsa Schiaparelli is one key Italian designer of this decade who was heavily influenced by the beyond the real art and incorporated it into her design. Proper attire for women was enforced for morning, afternoon and evening activities. In the early parts of the decade, wealthy women were still expected to change from morning to afternoon dress. Remember those episodes in the early 20s episodes in the Downton Abbey? I think that really captures the reality of that matter in the 1920s, where they were changing into 20s when they first cut their hair and changing, just still needing to change from daily, from meal to meal. Absolutely interesting fact. Now, in the early part of the decade, wealthy women were still expected to change from a morning to afternoon dress, as I've said before, and so these afternoon or tea gowns were less form-fitting, and then evening gowns featured long and flowing sleeves, were adorned with sashes and bows and artificial flowers in the waist. Evening gowns were typically slightly longer than tea gowns, in satin or velvet, and embellished with beads and rhinestones and fringe. Fringes were the typical roaring 20s flapper dresses, I believe. So let's look at the accessories. One of the key accessories in the 20s was the cloche. I'm not saying if I'm saying it right. Cloche hat. In the 26th Vogue stated, "Bob rules." Just 9 years after the influential dancer Irene Castle cut her hair, this trend topic inspired 1920s short story by F. Scott Fitzgerald called Bernice Bob's Her Hair. And in many editorials in Vogue throughout the decade, the bob hairstyle matched perfectly with the loose and straight silhouette of the times. During this era, Vogue gave credit to this new cut, the immense success in the hat business. New haircut means new style hats. Therefore, there was a new craze for hats, and cloche hat and bob were basically made for each other. Exactly. Jewelry was less conspicuous. Jewelry was less elaborate and romantic. More natural shapes took their place. The Art Nouveau movement in 1890 to 1910 inspired most of the natural forms and geometric shapes of the jewelry during the 20s. Aesthetic, clean lines were inspired by the design found in the industrial machines. A key influence of this modernism was the influential Bauhaus movement, with its philosophy of form following functions. Contrasting textures and colors were also in fashion. Examples of changing tastes in design were the use of diamonds being set against onyx, and translucid citrines and amethysts juxtaposed against the opaque coral and jade. All these shapes, even though geometric shapes and cleaner shape jewelry was now the trend, one of the key pieces of the long rope pearl necklace was a signature full piece that was sold everywhere in the time. It's inexpensive and basic for a woman wardrobe, although buffeted by the cycles of boom, depression of the war. Jewelry design in 1920s and 50s continued to be both innovative and glamorous. Sharp and geometry patterns celebrated the machine age, while exotic creations inspired by near and far east hinted jewelry fashions were truly international. Absolutely interesting. Shoes were finally visible during the 20s. Before, long garments covered up the shoes, so they were an important part of the women's fashion. Now shoes were seen as everyone and played a very important role during the 20s. Women had all kinds of shoes for all kinds of events, everything from house shoe, walking shoe, dancing shoes, sporting shoes to swimming shoes. The shoes industry became an important industry that transformed the way we buy shoes. Today, shoes were made in all different standard sizes, perfect to order from fashion catalogs to the near boutique. The bar shoe, which fastened with a strap and a single button, became most popular during the 20s, and it was worn with new short skirt and was practical for their vigorous style of dancing. Now let's look into the influence of jazz. The Jazz Age, a term coined by F. Scott Fitzgerald, was a phrase used to represent the mass popularity of the jazz music during the 1920s. Both jazz music and dance marked the transition from the archaic societal value of the Victorian era to the arrival of a new, youthful, modernistic society. Jazz gained much of its popularity due to its perceived exoticness, from its deep African roots to its melodic, soulful rhythm. The music itself had quite alluring effect on the new youthful society, and it was considered to be the pulse of 1920s. In fact, jazz music and the Charleston dance are responsible for the origin of iconic term flapper, a group of new socially unconventional ladies. When dancers did the Charleston, the fast movement of the feet and swaying arms resembled the flapping movement of a bird. Jazz music sparked the need to dance, and dance sparked the new need for the clothing, especially for women. Dances such as Charleston and Black Bottom in particular created need for a revival in the women's evening wear. Due to the dynamic and lively manner of these jazz dances, dress and skirt hem became shorter in order to allow the body to move more easily. In addition, decorative embellishment on the dresses such as fringe thread swung and jingled in sync with the movement of the body. Lastly, the use of glossy and ornate textiles mirrored the light tempo of the jazz music and dance. Jazz music and its perceived exotic nature had both a very flamboyant influence on fashion while keeping both form and function in mind. Interesting. This is where the music has affected the clothing and the minds of people so greatly. Jazz and its influence on fashion reached even further, both jazz and dance motifs making their way onto textile. These new textile designs included uneven repetition and linear geographic patterns. Many textile patterns produced in the United States also incorporated images of both jazz bands and people dancing to the jazz. The print Rhapsody shows textiles produced in 1925 representing a jazz band in a polka dot-like manner. Not only did textiles take motifs of people dancing and playing jazz music, they included the designs and that were based off the overall rhythmic feel and sound of the jazz music and dance. Now let's look at the figures. The boyish figure. Undergarments began to transform after World War I to conform to the ideals of the flatter chest and more boyish figures. Female figures like was liberated from the restrictive corsets, and newly popular, the boyish look was achieved through the use of bust bodices. Some of these new pieces included chemise, thin camisoles, cami knickers, later shortened to panties or knickers. These were primarily made from rayon and came in soft, light colors in order to be worn under semi-transparent fabrics. Young flappers look to these types of underwear due to the ability to move more freely and the increasing comfort when dancing to high-tempo music during the mid-1920s. All-in-one lingerie became a very popular thing. For the first time in centuries, women's legs were seen with hemlines rising to the knee and dresses becoming more fitted. A more masculine look became popular, including flattened breasts and hips, and short hairstyles such as the bob cut, Eton crop, and Marcel wave. The fashion was bohemian and forthcoming for its age. One of the first women to wear trousers and cut her hair and reject a corset was Coco Chanel, probably the most influential woman in fashion of the 20th century. Coco Chanel did much to further the emancipation and freedom of women's fashion. Jean Patou, a new designer in the French scene, began making two-piece sweater and skirt and outfits on a luxurious wool jersey, and had an instant hit for his morning dresses and sports suits. American women embraced the clothing of the designer as perfect for their increasingly active styles, lifestyles. At the end of the 1920s, Elsa Schiaparelli stepped onto the stage to represent a younger generation. She combined the idea of classic design from the Greeks and Romans with the modern imperative for freedom of movement. Schiaparelli wrote that the ancient Greeks gave to their goddesses the serenity of perfection and fabulous appearance of freedom. Her own interpretation produced evening gowns of elegant simplicity. Departing from a chemise, her clothes returned to an awareness of body beneath the evening gown. And now let's look at the menswear. In menswear, there were two distinct periods in the 1920s. Throughout the decade, men wore short suits, jackets, the long old jackets being used merely for formal occasions. In the early 20s, men's fashion was characterized by extremely high-waisted jackets, often worn with belts, lapels on. Suit jackets were not very wide as they tended to be buttoned up high. These styles of jackets seem to have been greatly influenced by uniforms worn by military during the First World War. Trousers were relatively narrow and straight, and they were worn rather short, so that the men's socks often showed. Trousers also began to be worn with cuffs at the bottom of at the time. By 1925, however, wider trousers, commonly known as Oxford bags, became the fashion, while suit jackets returned to normal waist and lapel became wider and were often worn peaked. Loose-fitting sleeves without a taper also began to be worn during the period. During the late 20s, double-breasted vests, often worn with single-breasted jackets, also became quite fashionable. During the 20s, men had a variety of sports clothes available to them, including sweaters and short trousers, commonly known in American English as knickers. For a formal occasion in the daytime, morning suits was usually worn. For evening wear, men preferred a short tuxedo to the tailcoat, which was now seen as a rather old-fashioned and snobby. Men's fashion also became less regimented and formal. Men favored short jackets with 2 or 3 buttons rather than jackets with the long tailcoats, as well as pinstriped suits. Casual wear for men often looked knickers and short pants that became to the knee. Now, the most formal men's suit consists of black or midnight worsted, swallow-tailed, a coat trimmed with satin, and a pair of matching trousers trimmed down to the sides with white braid or satin ribbons, white bow tie, black silk top hat, white gloves, and patent leather Oxford shoes, a white silk handkerchief, and a white flower boutonniere completed the outfit. The tuxedo vest could be black or white, but unlike obligatory full dress, white tie tuxedo ties were always black. Men usually completed their tuxedo outfit with the same accessories as full-dress suit, except that instead of the top hats, they usually wear dark, dome-shaped hats called bowlers, like Charlie Chaplin. Just like women, men had certain attire that was worn during the certain events. Tuxedos were appropriate for the attire at the theater, small dinner parties, entertaining in the home, and dining at the restaurant. During the 1920s, most men dress shirts had instead of collars a narrow neckband with buttonhole in both front and the back. So, by the mid-1920s, however, many men preferred shirts that attached collars, which were softer and more comfortable than rigid and detachable collars like starched ones that just hugs you like a prison. Men's hats. Now, men's hats usually worn depending on their classes, with upper-class citizens usually wearing a top hat or Homburg hat. Middle-class men wore a fedora, a bowler hat, or a trilby hat. During the summer months, a straw boater was popular for the upper class and middle-class men. Working-class men wore a standard newsboy cap or a flat cap. Now let's look at the simple facts. During 1920s, the notion of keeping up with the fashion trend, expressing oneself with material goods, seized the middle-class Americans as never seen before, purchasing new clothes or new appliances, new automobiles, new anything indicated to one's level of prosperity. Being considered old-fashioned or out of date, or worse yet, unable to afford the stylish new products, was a fate many Americans went to great lengths to avoid. For women, face, figure, coiffure, posture and grooming had become important fashion factors in addition to clothing. In particular, cosmetics became a major industry. Glamour was now an important fashion trend due to the influence of the motion pictures industry and famous female movie stars. Like the Singing in the Rain. Style and many social events was heavily influenced by the newly created larger-than-life movie stars. For the first time in history, fashion influencers and trends were becoming from more than one sources. Not unlike today, women and men of the 1920s looked to the movie stars as to their fashion icons. Women and men wanted to emulate the styles of Hollywood stars such as Louise Brooke, Greta Garbo, Rudolph Valentino, and Clark Gable. Now let's look at work clothes. For the working class women in the 1920s, tailored suits with a straight curveless cut were popular. Throughout the decades, the length of the skirts were rising to the knees and when the ankle, various of times affecting the skirt styles to be tailored suits. Rayon and artificial silk fabrics were also common for working class women clothing. For working class men's clothing, 1920s suits were popular. Depending on the job title and season for the year, suits would change. Now that would conclude today's 1920s fashion and fabulous times, jazz, everything, the lifestyles. I hope that you enjoyed. I know that the sounds of my neighbor walking and dropping things from time to time was a little bit hard for you to concentrate. It was hard for me to concentrate too, but I hope that you enjoyed this whole thing. And this is my cue to rest. Thank you so much for enjoying my video. I hope that you are relaxed right now, and I hope if you are relaxed, please let me know in the comments. I always read them. It gives me some light. Have a good day, have a good weekend, have a good weekday, and have a great day. And as always, good night everybody.